Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome to part one of my lecture on Chapter 12, Food Production and the Environment. I will say there are 80 or so slides to this lecture, but instead of breaking it up into three parts, I have decided to do it in two parts, but they will be two rather longish parts. Again, about 40 or so slides per part, as again, there are 80 total slides. So here we go, part one, Chapter 12. Food production and the environment. All right, so we start off with a core case study, as we usually do with these lectures and the book here that we're using this year for environmental science, talking about growing power in an urban food oasis. So what are we talking about here? Well, a food desert is urban areas where people have little or no easy access to nutritious food. So there is a company that was founded by a guy named Will Allen called Growing Power Inc. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which had an ecologically based farm in an urban area that uses solar power. It produces 150 varieties of organic produce. He recycles nutrients in a creative ways, and he provides education and training in organic farming methods. So again, this is the guy, Will Allen, again, founder of this Growing Power, again, an urban farm in Milwaukee. And again, the point of this is to show us as we go through this chapter, we're going to talk about how many people still on this planet do not have enough food. And one of the things that we need to figure out is how to provide enough food while also making sure we don't degrade the environment. What we're going to find out is that we've had a couple of revolutions called green revolutions that have helped us produce more food, but with each of those revolutions, we've degraded the environment. Believe it or not, mass food production is actually not good for the environment. So what we need to figure out, and you guys, again, coming up, you guys are going to be the next crop of adults who are going to try to figure this out, if you do happen to go into some sort of environmental science, is how do we produce enough food without degrading the environment? And again, Will Allen coming up with this urban ecological farm that he developed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to again try to answer that question. So why is good nutrition important? Well, many people in less developed countries have health problems from not getting enough food. Again, here in Ardsley, we don't necessarily think about that, even though there are people in Ardsley who have food insecurity as well. But in other parts of the country, other parts of the world especially, a lot of people do not get enough food that they need every day. So many people in more developed countries suffer health problems from eating too much food. So that's the other side of the coin here, right? We have a lot of countries, a lot of poor countries, people don't have enough food. Then you have countries like the United States where we have so much food that we eat too much, and we have health problems on the other side of the coin, right? Heart disease, obesity, things like that. What are the greatest obstacles to providing enough food for everyone? Poverty, war, bad weather, climate change, just to name a few. What are we seeing here? A tough picture to see, guys. This is a starving child in Somalia. His mother is feeding him. And I'll tell you what, obviously tough to see. And I'll be honest with you, when you have your own children one day, if you happen to head in that direction and have a family, it's even tougher to see stuff like this. So this is what we don't want to see anymore, guys. We need to fix this, right? We can't have young children looking like this around the world. That just isn't fair. So we need to figure it out. And that's what we're here to try and do. So many people suffer from lasting hunger and malnutrition. Couple of things to understand. There are macronutrients and there are micronutrients that our body needs. Macronutrients include carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Micronutrients include vitamins like vitamins A, B, C, and E, and minerals like iron, iodine, and calcium. Our body needs all of these to be properly nourished. So what is chronic undernutrition? That's when you don't have enough food to meet your basic energy needs. Energy meaning the body's energy here, okay? Not necessarily electrical energy or mechanical energy. It's the body's energy, right? So if you don't have enough food for the basic calorie intake that your body needs to function, you have chronic undernutrition. Chronic malnutrition is not enough protein or other key nutrients in your diet, and a famine is a severe shortage of food that could come via crop failures, maybe due to drought, flooding, or war. These famines can cause mass starvation, many deaths, economic economic chaos and social disruption. So, closer look at micronutrients. 2 billion people on this planet are deficient in one or more vitamins and minerals, right? So, if you don't have enough iron, this causes anemia, which is the deficit in iron. If you have iodine deficit, well, iodine is essential for thyroid function. So, a chronic lack of that iodine can cause stunted growth, mental retardation, and something called goiters. So again, things to think about if we don't get enough of these micronutrients in our diet. On the flip side, right, what are the health problems from eating too much? Kind of just what I talked about a couple of minutes ago. Overnutrition is excess body fat from too many calories and too little exercise. And unfortunately, in our well-developed countries like here in the U.S., many people have a problem with overnutrition. And believe it or not, you have similar health problems if you eat too much to those who don't eat enough, right? You have a lower life expectancy, greater susceptibility to disease and illness, and lower productivity and lower life quality. So again, eat too much, eat too little, kind of leads to the same problems. What we need to find is that middle ground, right, where everyone has just enough of the calorie intake that they need. So poverty is the root cause of hunger and malnutrition. Half of the world's people struggle to survive on $2.25 a day. Think about that for a second. Think about all the money we spend, and I'm included, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I don't do that, right? $2.25 a day. 50% of the world's people live on that. Could you live on that? Right? Could I? Think about it. It's powerful to think about. Poverty prevents daily access to nutritious food. Other obstacles, again, war, corruption, bad weather, and climate change. So, how is food produced, right? We talked about how we need food, right? How if you don't have food or have too much food, obviously, can lead to issues. So, how is food produced? Well, we have used high input industrialized agriculture and low input traditional agriculture to greatly increase food supplies here on planet Earth. All right, so food production has increased dramatically over the last 100 to 150 years. Three systems produce most of our food. Number one, croplands produce our grains, right? That's your rice, your wheat, your corn. Rangelands, pastures, and feedlots produce our meat and meat products, while fisheries and aquaculture provide us with fish products. All right, so those are the three ways that most of us get our food: croplands, rangelands, pastures, feedlots, and these fisheries and this aquaculture. Important technological advances have allowed us to produce much more food in a shorter period of time. That includes irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. All right, so we talked about on that first slide high input agriculture and low input agriculture. All right, so first we're going to talk about the high input. Industrialized crop production relies on high input monocultures. What does monocultures mean? You just have one type of plant growing in your field. So all wheat or all barley or all rice. Okay, you don't have mixtures. That's going to be polyculture, and we'll talk about that more in a few more slides. So, industrialized agriculture uses this high input monocultures, which means heavy equipment is needed for industrialized agriculture. Large amounts of financial capital, fossil fuels, water, inorganic fertilizers, and pesticides are used. Again, it's a single crop. What is the goal? To increase that crop yield. Okay. We also have something called plantation agriculture, which are cash crops. Primarily, these are in less developed countries. This is like your tobacco and your cotton that we had here in the United States, maybe 150, 200 years ago. We don't have as much of that anymore. We're more into the industrialized agriculture now. But again, plantation agriculture was kind of the industrialized agriculture of maybe 150 to 200 years ago. So this is a picture of harvesting wheat in the United States. Again, heavy equipment. That's that big piece of farm machinery you see there is needed. You need large amounts of seed, inorganic fertilizers, pesticides, and obviously what's running that big tractor there? Fossil fuels, right? And what you'll notice here, monoculture, rows and rows of just wheat. There is nothing else in this field but wheat, and we're going to talk about how monocultures are a disaster to biodiversity, right? Because think about biodiversity. You need all different niches for creatures to live in and to thrive in. You have one niche here. It's just wheat, right? So if you're an animal or an organism that doesn't live in wheat, you're not living in this field as far as the eye can see. Again, not good for the environment. Traditional agriculture, however, often relies on low input polyculture. So low input means we're not going to be using huge heavy equipment. We're not going to be using a lot of fossil fuels. We're not going to be using a lot of seed and inorganic fertilizers and pesticides. In addition, polyculture means you're going to be growing a lot of different type of crops all together, not just one type, a bunch of different types. So traditional subsistence agriculture, human labor and draft animals were used for family food. Traditional intensive agriculture is you have higher yields through increased labor, animal manure, and water. And then you have polyculture, again, several crops grown on the same farm. And again, it benefits your biodiversity over your monoculture. So organic agriculture is on the rise. Organic agriculture is more traditional, meaning you have crops grown without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. You use no genetically engineered seed varieties. We'll talk about that in a couple of more slides. Animals must be raised with 100% organic feed without antibiotics or growth hormones. Organic agriculture, however, more intensive, labor intensive than conventionally produced food. It's going to cost more, again, but the idea is that it is much, much better for the environment. So here are just some pros and cons between industrialized agriculture and more of your traditional polyculture, organic agriculture. And again, as you've known, as we've gone through this course, these are great slides to understand the yings and the yangs, the pros and the cons, so that you can use them for a potential FRQ. So industrialized agriculture uses synthetic inorganic fertilizers and sewage sludge to supply plant nutrients. They make use of synthetic chemical pesticides. Again, these are man-made pesticides and man-made fertilizers. Inorganic fertilizers are made by man. Organic means they come from organisms, right? Inorganic is basically chemicals. Uses conventional and genetically modified seeds. Depends on non-renewable fossil fuels, right? Mostly oil and natural gas. Produces significant air and water pollution and greenhouse gases. Yes, industrialized agriculture produces air and water pollution. It's globally export oriented, and it uses antibiotics and growth hormones to produce meat and meat products. On the flip side, organic agriculture emphasizes the prevention of soil erosion and the use of organic fertilizers such as animal manure and compost, again, natural fertilizer, but no sewage sludge to supply plant nutrients. Employs crop rotation and biological pest control. Biological pest control, we'll talk about a little more down the road, talks about using natural predators, right, to actually kill pests, not using sprays, synthetic stuff that we create chemicals, but actually using the insect or the pest's natural predator to actually get rid of the pest. Uses no genetically modified seeds. This is organic agriculture. Reduces your fossil fuel use and increases use of renewable energy, such as solar and wind power. Produces less air and water pollution and greenhouse gases. Is regionally and locally oriented. Again, organic agriculture, you kind of plant it and eat it where you grow it, and they use no antibiotics or growth hormones to produce meat and meat products. So once again, pros and cons of industrial and organic agriculture. All right, so let's dive in now and take a closer look at industrialized crop production. So we talked about this green revolution, right? The first green revolution started to increase crop yields, all right? This happened maybe about 100 years ago or so. We started coming up with these monocultures of high yield key crops, rice, wheat, corn. We used large amounts of fertilizers, pesticides, and water. We had multiple croppings going on, right? You're harvesting multiple times throughout the year. And it really actually worked in a sense that we were able to increase those crop yields and actually start reducing the amount of undernourished people on this planet. That was the first green revolution. Second green revolution came in, again, maybe about 50 to 60 years ago. And basically, we came up with genetically modified varieties of rice and wheat that grow very, very fast. So again, just another way that we increased our crop yields. And again, on paper, it looked like we did a very good job, right? We're finally nowing. Look at this. The world grain production tripled between 1950 and 2014, right? So again, on paper, it looks like a great thing. We came up with these green revolutions, right? The monocultures having rows of rice and wheat and corn. We're losing large amounts of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, water, and we're getting a lot of crop yields. We're feeding more people. Bravo. But unfortunately, we're now finding out that these revolutions actually, crop yields we'll talk about, are actually beginning to diminish a little bit now. And again, we are destroying the environment. But taking a look, here is grain production. Again, left is the grain production in millions of metric tons. On the right is per capita grain production, again, kilograms per person. And again, you'll notice from 1950 on to this date now, we are seeing an increase in both of that, which again is good news in the sense that we're now producing more and more food to feed more and more people. Again, though, we have to find that fine line between producing the amount of food people need and by, unfortunately, again, destroying our environment. So here's a case study of more industrialized food production in the United States. It's an agribusiness. We have a few giant multinational corporations that control the growing, processing, distribution, and sale of food. We do not have a lot of mom and pop farms left here in the United States. Food production, again, is very efficient. Americans spend about 9% of their income on food. The actual costs of food, however, are much higher. Again, the hidden costs of subsidies, pollution, and environmental degradation. We're not putting that full cost pricing into our food production like we talked about. And again, this is one of the reasons why the mass food production is degrading our environment. So, crossbreeding and genetic engineering produce new varieties of crops and livestock. So again, our first gene revolution involved crossbreeding through artificial selection, right? Slow process, but amazing results. What does this mean? Well, this people figured this one out thousands of years ago, right? That if I have a plant that has some small tomatoes and I have some plant here that has large tomatoes, and if I want medium tomatoes, well, what do? I take a seed from this plant, I merge it with some pollen from this plant, right? And I genetically engineer them, and over time, I just select the tomato plants that grow that nice medium-sized tomato that I want, right? Basically the crossbreeding between the big and the small, and then that whatever plant produces a perfect medium-sized tomato, that's then the seed and the that I use to plant the next plant, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, you can get a nice medium-sized tomato, right? So the results are amazing, but it's a slow process, right? Over generations and generations of that plant. Genetic engineering is our second gene revolution, right? So this, we actually alter the organism's DNA. Genetically modified organisms is what they're called, them GMOs, or transgenic organisms, okay? So we're actually going in and altering the DNA of the organism to then modify it to be what we want it to be. And that is called a GMO, or a genetically modified organism. So the first gene revolution was a little more natural. The second one, again, we're actually going in and putting in and pulling out DNA from the cells of these organisms. So that's basically what the difference is kind of between the genetically modified and the first step, or the first type of gene revolution, compared to the second gene revolution that we are dealing with now. All right, so that briefly talked about industrial agriculture. Now we're going to talk about industrialized meat production. So meat consumption has grown steadily between 1950 and 2010. The meat production has increased more than sixfold. Again, we're talking about pork, poultry, and beef products. Increased demand for grain, however, right? Because you got to feed all of these animals, right? These pigs, these cows, these chickens. So now you have an increased demand for grain. greater reliance on grain imports like China. But unfortunately, now that grain that you were making to feed people, now you are using to feed all these cattle and chickens and pigs. So again, we're kind of going away from, now we're using our monoculture to feed these animals, which again just kind of snowballs the adverse effects on the environment. About half of the world's meat are raised on rangelands, which are again more natural. However, half of the meat grown on this planet is actually grown in a factory farm system. I'm going to show you a picture of what that looks like, but it basically is just thousands and thousands of animals packed into these little pens where again they live their lives, and then we slaughter them for food. What we're looking at here, though, global meat production, again, millions of tons. On the left is globally. On the right is the U.S. versus China. And what you'll notice is in both graphs, the amount of meat production is going up, but you'll notice how much more in China over the past, let's say, 30, 40 years, have we seen that meat production increase. So again, on the surface, looks like a good thing. We're producing all of this food, all this meat for people to eat to try to, reduce the amount of malnutrition and starvation and famine out there. But again, as we're going to learn, not great for the environment. So this is what we're talking about, folks. This is industrialized meat production in Arizona, and what you are seeing here is just rows and rows and rows and rows of cattle that are just there living until they go off to the slaughterhouse. So again, not great for the environment, and we'll talk more about that later on in this chapter. All right, real quickly now, moving on. Again, we're talking about how all this food is produced, and then again we'll talk more about how it affects the environment coming down the road here. So fish and shellfish production, again, just like meat and agriculture, is growing very rapidly. What is a fishery? A fishery is a concentration of a particular species suitable for commercial harvesting. Again, what are they? They're areas that are offshore in the ocean where a particular species of fish seem to kind of hang out, and then we go there and we kind of catch them, right? However, 30% of our fisheries around the world are being overfished, with 50% of them already harvested at full capacity. So we have to figure out other ways to get our fish products, and we have, otherwise known as aquaculture. What is aquaculture? Well, it's basically fish farming, right? So we talked about real farming, then we talked about the meat production, right, in those industrialized meat plants. This is basically industrialized fish production in fish plants. They are just under the water, right? They're called aquaculture. Amount of fish and shellfish produced globally through aquaculture increased 12-fold from 1980 to 2014 as the wild catch leveled off and declined. Basically, we can't find any more of these wild fish because we've depleted all our fisheries, so we've decided to grow them in these fish farms that we call aquaculture. Farming of meat-eating species is growing rapidly. Again, they're fed fish meal or fish oil produced from other fish. So believe it or not, we actually have to get other fish to get in to actually, some of the fish eat the other fish. So there's this whole kind of process that goes on with this aquaculture. Again, what are we seeing? The wild catch is beginning to level off as the aquaculture is really beginning to increase, especially since 1990 or so. And again, I would argue that the aquaculture will probably catch up with the wild catch as we go through the next 10 to 20 years, as again, our wild catch, that's what you're catching out in the oceans, is declining. Again, our fish farms are beginning to increase. But once again, we're going to learn, not that great for the environment to have these fish farms. So industrialized food production requires huge inputs of energy. I don't care if it's aquaculture, I don't care if it's industrialized meat production, or if it's industrialized grain production. All three require huge inputs of energy. That's why we call them high input. Most of, unfortunately, are non-renewable energy sources like oil and natural gas. You need 10 units of fossil fuel energy for every 1 unit of food energy in the United States. Think about that. So for 1 unit of food energy, you need 10 units of fossil fuel energy to create that 1 unit. That is not good. That is obviously not where we need to be. The amount of energy per calorie used in the United States has declined 50% since the 1970s. All right, that's some good news. Less energy is required to produce nitrogen fertilizer, and we're seeing a rising use of conservation tillage. Again, these are ways to prevent environmental degradation on your land. Conservation tillage is a way to farm your land so that you don't get soil erosion, which again, if your soil erodes, you're not growing anything, right? So we have seen it decline a little bit, that average energy use per calorie, but still 1 unit of energy or 1 unit of food equals 10 units of fossil fuel energy needed to create that 1 unit of food. We need to change those numbers. We need to bring those numbers closer together. So here we go. What are then the environmental effects of industrialized food production? All right, so now we're going to start getting into what is wrong with it and why we need to change this industrialized food. So we talked about what it is, again, agriculture, meat, and fish, and now we're going to talk about the environmental effects. So factors that may limit future food production. Number one, soil erosion and soil degradation. We'll talk about that, but again, if you don't have soil with nutrients in it, you're not growing anything. I don't care. Desertification, what is that? That's when you actually turn croplands into deserts. Irrigation, water shortages, air and water pollution, climate change, and that loss of biodiversity. So, producing food has major environmental impacts. Industrialized agriculture has harmful environmental impacts, uses about 70% of the fresh water removed from aquifers and surface waters worldwide. 70% of the fresh water is used in industrialized agriculture. That only leaves 30% for people to drink. Industrialized agriculture emits 25% or a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases. A quarter, 25%, come from this industrialized food production. Industrialized food production produces 60% of all of the water pollution we have on the planet. Right? So it's not your automobile, it's not oil slicks, things like that. It's industrialized agriculture. 60% of the water pollution, 25% of world's greenhouse gases, 70% of fresh water is used for it. Again, these are not sustainable, right? This is the problem. We thought we did great. We thought we found a way to feed all these people. But unfortunately, we're harming the environment, which is now going to cause the industrialized agriculture to decrease crop yield, right? So we saw this massive increase, but now what we're going to see if we continue on this path is our crop yields begin to decrease because we don't have enough fresh water, the water is polluted, and the greenhouse gases are changing our climate, which is also changing the way crops grow. So again, major environmental impacts. Let's talk about them a little more here. Again, one of our charts, right? Food production, natural capital degradation, biodiversity loss, conversion of grasslands, forests, and wetlands to crops or rangelands. Again, you take a forest that has all these different species of plants for animals to live in, and then you change it to what you see here, right? This monoculture or this one type of plant as far as the eye can see. All those other creatures, they can't live there anymore. You destroy your biodiversity. Fish kills from pesticide runoff, right? We're spraying all these pesticides on our crops that are going into the rivers, are causing that eutrophication, right? Or those dead zones where the fish can't live. Killing of wild predators to protect livestock. People have gone out and killed coyotes and wolves and things like that. We're actually losing biodiversity that way, and a loss of agrobiodiversity replaced by those monocultural strains. Again, you're losing your agricultural biodiversity by just having rows and rows of the same crop. Soil problems, you have erosion, you have loss of fertility, you have something called salinization, which is too much salt that is left over in the soil, which plants do not grow in salt, guys. So you have this salt that's left over, waterlogging, and again, desertification, when you actually turn an area because you have used it so much for planting into a desert. Water issues, aquifer depletions, increased runoff, sediment pollution, and flooding from that cleared land, pollution from the pesticides. We talked about that. There we more. We talked about the eutrophication, the algae blooms, and fish kills caused by runoff of fertilizer and farm waste. Air pollution, again, emissions of greenhouse gases from the fertilizer, the methane from cattle, and from the big industrialized motorized tractors and things that you need, the equipment, the farm equipment, obviously other air pollutants from fossil fuel and pesticide sprays. Human health, nitrates are in drinking water, which could lead to something called blue baby syndrome. Pesticide residue in water, food, and air, livestock waste in our drinking and swimming waters, and bacterial contamination of meat. So again, here's all your natural capital degradation from this industrialized food production. All right, so we're going to go into these in a bit more detail. Obviously, soil erosion was the first one. What is that? Well, that's the movement of soil by wind and water. There are natural causes, but there are human causes, right? So three major harmful effects of soil erosion: loss of soil fertility, because what did we say? Remember, where's that humus layer, right? The humus is in the top layer, right, of your soil. That is where all your nutrients are. So if you blow or you erode that topsoil away, the top portion of the soil, your soil's not fertile anymore and you can't grow anything. Water pollution, right? I'm not talking about water pollution here from pesticides or chemicals, which it could be, but we're also just talking about sediment in the water. Sediment in the water is a major form of water pollution. It clogs aquatic systems. We've spoken about that already in this class. So when you have soil erosion, you have all this soil running off. It pollutes the water. You also release carbon that is stored in the soil as carbon dioxide, so that actually increases the amount of greenhouse gases. So basically, we've talked about this. What erodes more, a forest or a field? A field, right? So you cut down your forest to produce cropland. Now you got to worry about soil erosion, which can degrade your cropland to a point where you can't even use it anymore. And this is an example of it. This is topsoil erosion around the world. I believe this is in Kansas. You've heard about the Dust Bowl in the early 1900s, right? That was a direct result of this, all right? So again, when this happens and you get this topsoil erosion, your farm basically becomes useless. And here around the world, take a look at this. This is, you don't hear about topsoil erosion that much, right? But it is a serious problem. You'll notice in red, serious concern. In blue, just some concern. But look at where you're seeing a lot of reds. And unfortunately, you're seeing a lot of reds in our underdeveloped countries like India, right? Like China, like in the Middle East here, like in Africa. Again, these are issues. If you don't have topsoil, you don't have plants, you don't have crops, you unfortunately can't feed your people. All right, drought and human activities are degrading our dry land. So what is desertification? It is productive. It's when your productivity potential of your topsoil falls by 10% or more. This is caused by prolonged drought and human activities. Again, taking water out to irrigate crops somewhere else could form desertification in another part of the country, of the world. And again, human agriculture accelerates the desertification because it accelerates this erosion of the topsoil, which then leads to this desert type environment. And again, that's what happened during the Dust Bowl in the early 1900s. We had severe wind erosion of that topsoil, which basically made much of the Midwest into a desert, which again wasn't suitable for growing crops, and we didn't have a lot of crop yield during the years of the Dust Bowl. Excessive irrigation can actually pollute soil and water. So believe it or not, soil salinization is the gradual accumulation of salts in the soil from irrigation water. What happens is you're constantly irrigating the water. This water, though, has some salts in it. So as the water filters through your land and dries out, it leaves the salt behind. Well, over years and years and years of using irrigation to create enough water for your crops, you unfortunately increase the salt content of the soil, called soil salinization, and that lowers crop yields and eventually kills plants. Plants do not grow well in salt, and this actually affects 10% of the world's croplands are already dealing with soil salinization, which again is starting to lower those crop yields. So what did we talk about? I said when we started this industrialized agriculture, we saw those yields shoot up. Great, we made all this food for all these people, but now we're seeing some of the issues of it, like this soil salinization, which is actually lowering the crop yields, right? So as right now it only affects 10% of the world's croplands, but if we continue with this mass irrigation on these industrialized agricultural type farms, that number of 10% is going to increase. And again, that's going to unfortunately cause our crop yields to begin decreasing at some point. In addition, we have waterlogging. Irrigation water gradually raises the water table in an area. This can deprive plants of oxygen and once again affects about 10% of the world's cropland. So plants can't grow in flooding, and when you're constantly irrigating land, you're constantly adding water that maybe shouldn't be there naturally, right? And so you're potentially raising the water temperature, which could kill plants, which again would reduce that crop yield that we liked. Here is an example. This is the white salts. This is your salt salinization. Again, this used to be a cropland, but over time, all the irrigation left over these salts in the soil that now the soil is basically unusable and you can't grow anything there. Eventually, could you get this to the point if you use some mitigation processes to get the soil fertile again? Absolutely. It just costs a lot of money to do so. It's much better to not get to a situation like this first. That's really the name of the game here. Industrialized crop production contributes to pollution and climate change. Again, keep talking more about what are these environmental effects. So eroded topsoil flows into streams. Aquatic organisms ingest pesticide residue, and then we ingest those aquatic organisms, right? Not good. Farmers contribute to pollution through over-fertilizing. Nitrates contaminate groundwater used for drinking. Agricultural activities comprise more than 25% of the human-generated carbon dioxide emissions, right? We're always hearing about how our cars, how these factories are producing all of this carbon dioxide. Well, about a quarter of it is being produced by our farms. You do not hear that often in the news when they talk about climate change. Well, CO2 emissions, a quarter of that comes from our industrialized agriculture. Producing food and biofuel reduces biodiversity. We talked about this, right? Biodiversity is threatened when forest and grasslands are replaced with cropland. So agrobiodiversity, genetic variety of animals and plant species used on farms to produce food, we've lost 75% of that since 1900. Efforts to save endangered crop varieties, something called refrigerated seed banks, are being put into effect to try to save some of these crop varieties. But again, 75% have been lost because we're using these monoculture now, or just one type of crop. So again, what is biofuel, right? Biofuel is the fuel that we're kind of trying to use from crops, right, to create fuel for cars and things like that. However, what we're finding out is that to create this biofuel, we have to produce monoculture type crops, right? We got to create rows and rows and rows of the same type of crop to produce the biofuel. And again, that is destroying our biodiversity. All right, we've only halfway done with this chapter as of now. Again, we're going to talk more about the environmental impacts of agricultural food production, or industrialized agricultural food production in part 2. We'll also talk a little bit about why mom and pop type farms, right, that polyculture, low input food production may actually be the better way to head down the road in the future if we want to increase or continue to see our crop yields increase. But more on that in part 2, so make sure to watch that. For now, though, this concludes part 1 of my lecture on chapter 12, food production and the environment. And as always, I thank you for listening.